those of us that can adjust our needle from left and right, you want to go 3 clicks from where your final stitching would be away from the piping and do your basting of the initial piping and use a longer stitch, like 3.5, 4. And I did all this for a program I did for the Saturday group. This is a long time ago. But this one's all different colors of stitching, and you can tell that the first one is farther away. Then the next time when you sew it to your garment in the position you're sewing, you want to go to the second click. And then when you finally sew it on the final time, you go to the third click, and that's the closest. But you don't want to get so close to the piping that it is, I don't want to call it trapped, but so tight that it pulls on it. And so anyway, this was just a sample from that, and I did all the different stitches in different colors. And you want to do it in bias because bias goes around corners. Bias also doesn't ravel, so when you have to trim clip corners, everything is not going to ravel away from you. The other thing that I always forget how to do is join piping, and never fails. I sew it thinking, oh, I know how to do this. And it's this big weird L. So what you want to always do is, my way to remember is I'm not left-handed. So I have my main piece in my left hand going straight down, and my second piece is pointing to my favorite hand. Now I always have to put a pin in here because I will constantly sew the wrong way. But I always pin test first, but then you sew from the right to the left. And then you'll end up with a bias join, and you can trim off your excess and go from there. Okay. Now there's a lot of different kinds of things you can put in piping. Believe it or not, one of my favorites is my kitchen string. I have this really nice kitchen string, and I really like it, and it's cotton. So I always throw it in hot water before I start. The next thing, which I never seem to have enough of, is rat tail cord. Rat tail cord is nice. It has a real firm cover on it, and there's 2 sizes of it. This green one is mouse tail. It's smaller. Rat tail is a little bigger, and that's the gold one. And a little bit later, I'll show you why they're good for a lot of different things. That's basic piping. And when you go to sew it in your garment, you need it to be the cord, and then you have, I don't know, I guess you call it the header. And that header needs to be consistent so that when you lay it down next to the edge of your fabric, that header then goes to the edge of the fabric, and then the stitching line would be the actual stitching line on your garment. And I have this lovely tool. I got it from Linda McGehee, and it looks really weird, but when I pass it around, you'll be able to see there's little grooves in it. And what it does is you can lay the piping down, and there are 1/4-inch seam allowances and 1/2-inch seam allowances. And what you do is you put it down on there so the cord fits in the groove, and you use your rotary cutter and your rotary mat to cut your seam allowance even. And it just slides along, and it's steady as opposed to using your ruler, because you know the ruler rocks. But anyway, it's a real cool thing. The only trick is you either have to use your rotary cutter kind of at an angle because it's kind of thick, or you use the big blade. But it just slides along your piping. It's a handy little tool because it makes your edges consistently, which is important. Because otherwise, you know, everything's not even around the edge. So the reason I wanted to do this today is I had come across this a while back, is how to make double piping, but it doesn't have the seam showing. This is my sample, and you can't see the thread in here, which if you did regular piping and laid two on top of each other, you'd have that seam, that line of thread showing. But the trick is, it uses, and I put this on here because this little bitty foot, I don't want to lose my little foot. It's a 5-groove piping foot, or pin tuck foot. Pin tuck foot. This is what lets you, instead of a zipper foot, because it has a pretty big hole, this is the tool that you're going to use to help you. Some of the zipper feet for invisible zippers have those channels in them. And depending on the size of your piping, different feet, like piping feet come in different, I guess. Sometimes, you know, your piping is different sizes and you want to have the piping foot fit better. And if you flip your feet over, like my zipper foot has channels in it. And so it can be used for invisible or regular zippers. And so that's another option that you can use. I'm going to start by, the whole thing starts with your bias strips. And what you want to do is you want to put the piece that you want to be the outside or the top edge piping on top. And so you're going to layer your piping pieces, right sides together, on top of each other. Then you're going to lay your cording down the middle, and you're going to fold up one side. So you still have, you still can see this top side of this. Then you're going to stitch your three clicks. And you're going to have that foot will fit just perfectly on this cording. And you stitch along. Okay, then what you do is you flip it over. Okay, flip it over so that the top piece, okay, I have to think about this for a minute. Okay, so then what you want to do is you want to flip it over so that all 3 cut edges are at the top. That's why I gave you the instructions. It's so simple, but you have to follow the steps. Okay, so you flip it over so the 3 are at the top. Then you turn it over and you lay your cord next to the original stitching. And then you fold the cord over and you stitch with the 3rd click. And if you use that cord, that pin tuck foot, they'll just go straight next to each other. It just helps as another guide. Now you're ready to use 2 different colors, one in the bobbin and one in the top. And if on my sample, when you look at it, there's a purple thread. It doesn't quite match. And then the other side is the white. You want to have whatever color is next to the bed of the machine to be your bobbin thread. And whatever's on top would be the top thread. And that way. But in doing that, there's a really cool trick that it works best with the rat tail cord or the mouse tail cord. You know, here we've got the foot out and we're making piping. Well, if you want to make a nice little cord, and it can be filled or not, it can be self-filled, if you take your bias strip and you lay the cord in like you're going to make piping, and you leave this little end out, then you stitch across it, and then always when you start to make a cord, if you will start a little wider at the top, Then stitch your stitching. Then you can pull on this, and it's always interesting to get it started. But it'll turn in on itself. Now, if you're going to make spaghetti straps, this is what you do, is you stretch this as you sew it, and I did stretch it, that's why this looks a little weird. When you're sewing, you want to get as much stretch out of it as possible as you sew, because a spaghetti strap, if it's supposed to support something, it could pop those stitches. And so you want as sturdy a tube as you can get. So if you pull it when you're stitching it, and it makes this fabric gets kind of narrow, but then when you get done, you won't have pop stitch. If you want it firmer, even you can make that string even longer.
Make it twice as long.
Right, make it twice as long, and then you will have the seam allowance and the cord in the tube. Anyway, that is it. But I thought it was such a hint, a nice little hint that we all have something we can use in our sewing supplies that make our life easier. And I thought, you know, this is just too simple. Okay, that's it.